There comes a moment in life when regret knocks loudly on the door of those who once felt powerful. Not the gentle regret of a missed opportunity, but the heavy regret that arrives when a person realizes they crossed a line they can never uncross. It is the kind of regret that wakes them at night, that follows them into silence, that whispers their own name back to them with accusation. They remember you then, not as you were when you were quiet, patient, forgiving, but as the turning point in their story, the mistake they cannot undo. They thought you were harmless. That was their first error. They mistook your restraint for weakness, your silence for surrender, your kindness for permission. They believed that because you did not strike back, you could be struck endlessly, and for a while they were comfortable in that belief. Comfort often breeds cruelty. When people feel safe from consequence, they grow careless with the souls of others. But there is a law woven deeper than human justice, older than any courtroom or apology. It is the law that what is done in darkness eventually demands payment in the light. They crossed you thinking nothing would happen. They spoke, acted, betrayed, dismissed and wounded, assuming time would bury it all. Time, however, is not a grave. It is a witness. Now they regret it. You can see it in the way their confidence has thinned, in the way their words hesitate where arrogance once lived. They replay the moments in their minds, wishing they had stopped themselves, wishing they had chosen differently. They wish they could return to the version of you who still trusted them, still hoped, still gave the benefit of the doubt. But that version of you no longer exists, and the world does not run backward to spare the guilty. Regret, when it comes late, is a cruel companion. It does not heal what was broken. It does not erase what was said. It does not restore what was stolen. Regret only reveals the truth too late to change it. And that is what haunts them most. Not that they feel sorry, but that their sorrow has no power left. They look at you now and realize something terrifying. You survived them. Not only did you survive, but you changed. You grew quieter, stronger, more discerning. The access they once had is gone. The influence they once enjoyed has evaporated. They sense that the door they slammed behind them did not merely close, it locked. What they did not understand then, but understand painfully now, is that crossing someone who walks with integrity is never a small thing. A person anchored in truth does not need revenge. Life itself begins to rearrange around such people. Paths open, protection forms, strength settles in the bones. And those who once caused harm find themselves strangely displaced, unsettled, and exposed. They regret crossing you because the cost is now visible. Their own lives feel heavier. Their peace is fractured. Their confidence leaks away in moments of quiet reflection. They carry the knowledge that they wronged someone who did not deserve it, and that knowledge does not let them rest. And here is the hardest truth they face. Regret does not save them now. It cannot follow you into your healing. It cannot accompany you into your growth. It cannot stand between them and the consequences of who they chose to be. Regret is a realization, not a rescue. You, on the other hand, were refined by the fire they lit. What they intended to break became the place where something stronger formed. And while they are left bargaining with yesterday, you are standing firmly in today, unchained, awake, and no longer available to be crossed. They mistook your silence for permission, not understanding that silence is often chosen by those who see farther than the moment. You did not speak because you were weak. You did not respond because you were afraid. You were quiet because you were measuring the weight of things, because you understood that not every provocation deserves an answer, and not every insult deserves a reaction. But to them, silence looked like emptiness. They assumed nothing was happening inside you. They assumed no record was being kept. Silence to shallow minds always appears passive. They believe power must be loud, that strength announces itself, that authority proves itself through noise and dominance. So when you stayed calm, when you withheld confrontation, when you chose restraint over retaliation, they misread it as an invitation. They thought your patience meant you would always endure. They believed your kindness meant you would always excuse. And slowly, without realizing it, they began to step where they should never have stepped. They spoke words they would not have dared to speak to someone who shouted back. They crossed boundaries they would have respected if you had defended them loudly. Your composure became their justification. If it really hurt, they told themselves, you would have said something. And so they kept going. Silence in their minds became consent. What they failed to grasp was that silence can be a form of judgment, a space where a person decides whether another still deserves access to their presence. There is a dangerous arrogance that grows in people when they believe they are untouchable. It convinces them that consequences only happen to others, that lines exist for decoration, not discipline. They thought they were safe because you did not react. They thought nothing was changing because you did not protest. They did not notice that while you were quiet on the outside, something firm was forming within you. Silence was not the absence of strength, it was the gathering of it. You were watchy, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Each word, each action, each small betrayal quietly added weight to a scale they could not see. You were learning who they truly were when they believed no cost existed. Silence has a way of revealing people. When no immediate resistance appears, character shows itself without disguise, and what they revealed in those moments cannot be unseen. They believed restraint was weakness because they had never practiced it themselves. They did not know the discipline it takes to remain composed when hurt would justify anger. They had never learned that self-control is not passive, it is deliberate. They acted freely because they assumed you would always absorb the damage. They did not consider that endurance has a limit, not because patience fails, but because wisdom eventually intervenes. At some point, without announcement, you stopped offering the benefit of the doubt. You stopped explaining yourself. You stopped trying to be understood. Silence changed its nature. It was no longer patience, it was distance. And distance is the first boundary that cannot be argued with. They sensed something had shifted but could not name it. You were still quiet but no longer available, still calm but no longer open. That is when confusion began to replace confidence. They tried to replay the past, searching for the moment things changed, never realizing it had been changing all along. Every time they crossed a line and faced no immediate response, they moved closer to a consequence that did not need your voice to arrive. Silence had already done its work. It had documented, it had clarified, it had decided. They learned too late that silence is not permission. It is often the last courtesy before separation. It is the pause before access is revoked, before trust expires, before a person withdraws not in anger but in resolve. And once silence, earns into distance, no apology spoken afterward can return things to what they were, because the decision was made long before regret ever found its voice. Comfort made them careless, and carelessness gave birth to cruelty. When people settle into comfort without accountability, something subtle but dangerous begins to grow inside them. They stop checking themselves. They stop weighing their words. They stop asking whether they are being fair or kind. Comfort dulls awareness, and once awareness is dulled, conscience is not far behind. They were comfortable with you being patient, comfortable with you being forgiving, comfortable with you absorbing what they refused to carry themselves. At first, The harm was small enough to disguise: a careless remark, a dismissive tone, a moment of disrespect brushed aside as nothing serious. Comfort whispers that small things do not matter. It convinces people that they can test limits without consequence, and each time nothing immediately happened, their comfort deepened. What once would have felt wrong began to feel normal. What once required justification no longer required thought. Carelessness rarely announces itself as cruelty. It presents itself as honesty, as humor, as just being real. They excused their behavior by calling it harmless, by insisting you were too sensitive, by suggesting you misunderstood their intentions. Comfort allowed them to believe their own explanations. It shielded them from self-examination. When a person no longer examines themselves, they inevitably begin to injure others without noticing. There is something deeply unsettling about cruelty that grows out of ease rather than anger. Anger at least recognizes conflict. Careless cruelty does not even see the damage it causes. It steps on what is fragile because it never bothered to look down. They were not driven by hatred, they were driven by indifference. And indifference can wound more deeply than hostility because it denies the humanity of the one being hurt. As their comfort increased, their empathy decreased. They stopped imagining how their actions landed. They stopped listening for the quiet signals of harm. They grew bold in ways that only people who feel secure from consequence can. Comfort gave them the illusion of superiority. It convinced them that they could speak without restraint, act without reflection, and still keep your presence intact. What they did not realize was that comfort is borrowed, not owned. It exists only as long as conditions allow it. They assumed your tolerance was permanent. They believed your patience was inexhaustible. They confused generosity with obligation. In doing so, they treated what was freely given as something they were entitled to exploit. Carelessness always escalates. Once the line of decency is crossed without resistance, it becomes easier to cross again. What began as disregard slowly hardened into disrespect. What began as thoughtlessness evolved into something sharper, colder, more deliberate. Comfort had trained them to believe they could take without giving, speak without listening, wound without consequence. They did not see how their behavior was changing because comfort blinds gradually. It does not shock, it numbs. And in that numbness they became less careful with your dignity, less mindful of your boundaries, less aware of your value. They spoke as though you would always be there to absorb the weight of their words. They acted as though your presence was guaranteed, regardless of how they treated it. Yet even as their carelessness grew, yours did not. You were paying attention. You noticed the pattern forming. You recognized that what you were experiencing was not an accident, but a habit. Comfort had removed their discipline, and without discipline, cruelty slips in quietly, almost politely, until it becomes unmistakable. They grew comfortable crossing lines because no one stopped them early. They mistook the absence of immediate consequence for approval. But comfort built on another person's silence is fragile. It collapses the moment awareness returns. And when awareness does return, it does not arrive gently. It arrives with the realization that what felt safe was built on borrowed grace, and borrowed grace, once exhausted, leaves nothing behind to soften the fall. They crossed a line believing time would erase the damage, forgetting that time remembers everything. There is a strange comfort people take in delay. They assume that if a consequence does not arrive immediately, it will never arrive at all. Time to them feels like a solvent that dissolves guilt, smooths over wrongs, and blurs sharp edges into forgettable shapes. They told themselves that whatever they did would fade, that memory would soften, that life would simply move on and carry the evidence away. This belief gave them courage where they should have had caution. They acted with the confidence of people who assume history is short and forgiveness automatic. Each passing day without confrontation strengthened their illusion. If it mattered, they thought, it would have surfaced by now. They mistook delay for dismissal. They confused patience with amnesia. But time is not a forgetful companion. It does not erase, it records. It stores details quietly, without commentary, without drama. It remembers tone, intent, repetition. It remembers not just what was done, but how often it was done and how easily it was justified. Time does not rush to judgment, but it never loses the file. They believe that because you did not constantly revisit the hurt, it had lost its weight. They assumed that silence meant healing had already occurred. What they failed to understand is that healing and remembering are not opposites. A person can move forward and still remember clearly. Time did not make you forget, it gave you perspective. It allowed patterns to emerge that were invisible in the moment. Each incident taken alone could be minimized. Each word, isolated, could be excused. But time stitched them together into a story they could no longer deny. What once looked like misunderstandings began to look like choices. What once felt accidental began to look intentional. Time did not exaggerate their actions, it clarified them. They underestimated how memory works in a thoughtful soul. Memory does not always scream. Sometimes it waits, observing, comparing, learning. With time, you saw not only what they did, but who they were becoming while doing it. Time showed you that the damage was not a single moment, but a trajectory. They thought distance from the moment would protect them. Instead, distance stripped away their excuses. When emotion faded, truth stood clearer. When urgency passed, reality remained. Time removed the chaos that once distracted from the harm and left only the facts behind. Time also worked on you in ways they did not anticipate. It strengthened your discernment. It sharpened your understanding. It taught you that certain lines, once crossed, can not be uncrossed, not because of bitterness, but because of wisdom. Time helped you recognize that trust is not rebuilt by forgetting, but by accountability. And accountability never appeared. They believed time would bury what they had done. Instead, time elevated it. It brought it into sharper contrast against your growth, your boundaries, your clarity. As you matured, the damage stood out more distinctly, not less. Time did not soften it, it exposed it. There is a quiet irony in how time works against those who rely on it to escape responsibility. The longer they wait, the more complete the record becomes. Each day added context. Each silence added confirmation. Each unaddressed wrong reinforced the conclusion that what happened was not a mistake, but a pattern. They now realized that time was never on their side. It was only patient. And patience, when it ends, does not do so noisily. It simply presents the truth fully formed. They crossed a line thinking time would erase it, not knowing that time had been carefully preserving every detail, waiting for the moment when denial would no longer be possible. What was done in darkness began to demand accountability in the light. At first, everything felt hidden enough to escape consequence. Words spoken when no one else was listening, actions taken quietly away from scrutiny, decisions justified by secrecy. Darkness gave them confidence. It convinced them that unseen meant unfelt, that unspoken meant unresolved. They relied on shadows to protect them, believing that what remained private could never become permanent. Darkness has a peculiar way of emboldening people. It removes the immediate pressure of being seen, of being judged, of being held responsible. In the absence of witnesses, They allowed themselves to become versions of themselves they would never display publicly. They acted without restraint, assuming invisibility was safety. What they did not understand is that darkness does not erase truth. It only delays its exposure. Every hidden act carries weight, even when no one acknowledges it aloud. Every quiet betrayal leaves an imprint. Darkness may conceal actions from others, but it never conceals them from reality itself. The world has a way of keeping balance, even when humans fail to enforce it. What is planted in secrecy still grows. It simply grows underground, strengthening its roots before it ever breaks the surface. At first, accountability arrived subtly, not as confrontation but as discomfort, a faint unease, a restlessness they could not explain. The light did not burst in suddenly. It crept in slowly, illuminating edges, revealing shapes they had tried not to see. Small consequences appeared, missed opportunities, strained connections, unexplained losses of ease. They brushed these off as coincidence, refusing to connect them to their actions. But light is persistent. It does not argue. It reveals. And as time passed, the shadows they relied on became thinner. The lies required more effort to maintain. The justifications began to sound hollow, even to themselves. What once felt hidden started to feel heavy. Accountability does not always arrive through exposure to others. Sometimes it begins internally, when denial collapses under its own weight. They began to realize that secrecy does not prevent consequences. It concentrates them. What is not addressed early accumulates. What is not corrected quietly demands correction loudly. Darkness delays reckoning, but it also amplifies it. By the time the light arrives, the cost is no longer small enough to manage privately. You did not have to expose them. You did not have to demand justice. Light has its own intelligence. It reveals through outcomes, through shifts, through the slow rearrangement of circumstances. True, surfaces in the way people respond differently, in the way trust evaporates without explanation, in the way doors once open begin to close without apology. They notice that the world no longer met them the way it used to. Respect thinned, favor faded, stability wavered. They could not point to a single moment when everything changed, only a growing sense that something had caught up with them. That is how accountability often arrives, not with accusation, but with consequence. What unsettled them most was realizing that nothing needed to be said for the truth to stand. No speech, no confrontation, no exposure was required. The light simply revealed what had already been decided by their own actions. They were facing results, not rumors, outcomes, not opinions. Darkness had once made them feel powerful. Light made them feel small, not because they were being punished publicly, but because they were being measured accurately. And accuracy leaves no room for excuses. The light does not exaggerate wrongdoing. It shows it exactly as it is, stripped of narrative and self-defense. They learn too late that what is hidden is not protected, it is merely postponed. And when accountability finally emerges, it does not negotiate. It does not ask whether they are ready. It arrives when truth has matured enough to stand on its own, fully visible, undeniable, and no longer willing to remain in the dark. Regret arrived only after power slipped from their hands. While they believed they were in control, regret had no place to stand. Control numbs reflection. It convinces people that outcomes are theirs to command, that they can bend situations without consequence, that they will always have time to correct themselves later. As long as they felt secure, regret remained distant, unnecessary, almost laughable. Why regret what still appears to be working? Power creates a dangerous illusion that one's position is permanent. When people feel untouchable, they do not look inward. They do not revisit their choices. They do not question their behavior. Power silences conscience by keeping attention fixed outward, on advantage, on leverage, on what can still be taken or maintained. While they stood above consequence, regret had no reason to speak. They were too busy asserting themselves, too occupied with maintaining dominance, too confident in their ability to manage outcomes. Even when small signs of imbalance appeared, they dismissed them. Power allows people to explain away warning signals as temporary setbacks or misunderstandings. As long as influence remains intact, self-examination feels unnecessary. But power is rarely lost all at once. It erodes quietly. Influence weakens. Access narrows. Authority fades in subtle ways that are easy to ignore at first. And still, regret does not come. Not yet. Regret waits until illusion collapses. Only when control slipped beyond reach did reflection begin. Only when they realized they could no longer shape the situation did they start reviewing the past. When reactions no longer worked. When explanations stopped landing. When you were no longer persuadable, reachable, or affected. That is when regret finally found its voice. Regret does not usually emerge from moral clarity, it emerges from loss of leverage. When people can no longer fix things through control, they attempt to fix them through feeling. Regret becomes a substitute for power. It says what authority once accomplished. It tries to reopen doors that influence once held open. They look back not because they suddenly grew wiser, but because they were suddenly powerless. The moment they realized the outcome was no longer theirs to adjust, memory began to sharpen. Words once dismissed replayed with new weight. Actions once justified appeared reckless. They began to see the cost of what they had done only after they no longer had the ability to undo it. There is a particular bitterness in regret that follows lost power. It carries panic. It carries urgency. It carries the awareness that something essential has slipped beyond recovery. They were not regretting because they had changed. They were regretting because the situation had. What unsettled them most was recognizing that their regret did not restore what was lost. It did not return access. It did not reopen trust. It did not reset the balance. Regret arrived late to a decision already finalized by reality. It showed up after the door had closed, after the distance had set, after you had moved beyond the reach of persuasion. They attempted to express remorse in hopes that emotion might succeed where control failed. But remorse cannot negotiate what power has already forfeited. Regret is not influence. It does not command outcomes. It only acknowledges them. And so they were left sitting with awareness without agency, conscious of their mistake, yet unable to repair it. Regret is especially cruel in this position because it brings clarity without permission to act. It reveals the truth precisely when the ability to change it is gone. They learn something painful in that moment. Power delays regret, but it also magnifies it. The longer conscience is postponed, the heavier its arrival becomes. Regret did not come when it could have corrected behavior. It came when behavior had already shaped destiny. And once power is gone, regret has nothing left to offer but understanding. Understanding that arrives too late, speaks too softly, and saves nothing that has already moved beyond their control. Their sorrow revealed truth, but too late to undo the harm. There is a kind of sorrow that does not arrive as repentance, but as realization. It is not born from love, what is right, but from confrontation with what is lost. When their sorrow finally surfaced, it did not come gently. It came with sharp clarity, forcing them to see what they had avoided for so long. They finally understood the weight of their actions, not because their hearts had softened early enough to change course, but because reality had closed every exit. Sorrow has a way of stripping away illusion. It removes the protective stories people tell themselves to remain comfortable. In sorrow, excuses collapse. Justifications lose their strength. What remains is an unfiltered view of what was done and what it cost. They saw themselves clearly then, perhaps for the first time. They recognized the selfishness disguised as confidence, the indifference mistaken for strength, the entitlement hidden beneath familiarity. Sorrow told them the truth they had resisted hearing while it still mattered. But sorrow, when delayed, does not repair. It only exposes. By the time they felt it fully, the damage was already woven into the fabric of things. Trust had already withdrawn. Distance had already settled. Decisions had already been made quietly, without ceremony. Their sorrow arrived not at the moment of choice, but at the moment of consequence. There is a tragic irony in late sorrow. It proves that awareness was always possible. It confirms that understanding could have come sooner, had humility been allowed earlier. The capacity to recognize wrong was never absent, it was merely postponed. And postponement, in matters of the heart, is rarely neutral. What is delayed becomes denied, and what is denied eventually becomes irreversible. They may have wished that their sorrow could function as currency, something to trade for restoration. But sorrow is not payment. It does not rebuild what was dismantled through repeated disregard. Tears shed after the structure has collapsed, not restore its foundation. Sorrow acknowledges loss, but it cannot resurrect what was dismantled piece by piece. What made their sorrow heavier was the realization that you had already processed what they were only beginning to feel. You had grieved quietly, earlier, when repair was still possible. You had sat with the pain while they were still comfortable. By the time sorrow reached them, you were no longer waiting for understanding. You had already adjusted your expectations to reality. Their sorrow exposed the truth about timing. It showed that emotions have seasons, and when missed, they cannot simply be summoned later to undo the past. Understanding that arrives after consequence does not function as wisdom, it functions as memory. It tells the story accurately, but too late to change its ending. They were left confronting a painful distinction. Knowing the truth does not equal having the power to act on it. Sorrow gave them insight, but insight without opportunity is a heavy burden. It forces a person to live with awareness unaccompanied by agency. They could see clearly now, but clarity no longer granted access. This kind of sorrow often seeks an audience, hoping that confession might reopen what was closed. But confession spoken after withdrawal does not restore intimacy, it only confirms why withdrawal occurred. Their sorrow did not soften the boundary you had already set, it only illuminated its necessity. The truth sorrow revealed was not only about their actions, but about their priorities. They saw that they had valued control over care, comfort over conscience, familiarity over respect. And seeing this did not undo it. It simply named it. Sorrow, in the end, became a witness rather than a remedy. It testified to what should have been addressed sooner. It validated the distance that now existed, and while it brought them understanding, it did not bring them relief, because relief belongs to those who change in time, not to those who realize after the moment for change has passed. They learned that sorrow is not redemption when it arrives late. It is recognition without restoration, awareness without repair, truth uncovered after the damage has already written itself into the future. They mourn the version of you that no longer exists, the one who trusted them. What aches most is not simply losing your presence, but losing the version of you that made them feel secure. That earlier self of yours believed explanations, softened boundaries, and assumed good intentions, even when evidence suggested otherwise. That version stayed longer than wisdom required, hoping understanding would eventually arrive. It is that version they search for now, not realizing it cannot be summoned back. They remember how easily you once opened yourself, how you listened without defensiveness, how you offered patience without keeping score. Trust made you accessible. It made conversation possible. It made repair imaginable. And because that trust existed, they felt protected from consequence. They believed they could always return, always explain, always be forgiven. Trust to them felt like permanence. What they do not fully grasp is that trust is not erased in a single moment. It fades through repetition. Each time something was dismissed, minimized, or ignored, a small fracture formed. You did not announce it. You did not dramatize it. You simply adjusted quietly, recalibrating how much of yourself you offered. Trust did not vanish, it retreated. They may tell themselves that you changed suddenly, that distance appeared without warning, but change rarely announces itself to those who benefit from the old arrangement. While they remained comfortable, you were learning discernment. While they assumed stability, you were noticing patterns. The version of you they mourn was already leaving long before they noticed the absence. That earlier you believed in explanation, believed that clarity would solve what misunderstanding caused, believed that if hearts were sincere enough, resolution would follow. Over time, experience taught you that some harm is not caused by confusion, but by choice. Trust cannot survive repeated choices that prioritize comfort over care. They mourn that earlier you because that version required less from them. It did not demand accountability. It did not enforce consequences. It absorbed discomfort in the hope of preserving connection. That version made their lives easier, and ease, once lost, is often mistaken for love. What hurts them now is realizing that you no longer respond the same way. Your silence feels different. Your calm carries weight. You are no longer persuadable by words alone. Trust once made you responsive. Clarity makes you selective. They feel this shift deeply, even if they cannot articulate it. They may attempt to appeal to your past self, invoking shared memories, old language, familiar emotions. They speak as though the past version of you is still listening. But that version has already learned its lessons. It has already paid its cost. It stepped aside so a more grounded self could stand in its place. This mourning is complicated by guilt. They know, even if only subconsciously, that their actions contributed to the disappearance of that trusting self. They realize they were present for its erosion. That realization carries discomfort because it places responsibility where they would rather avoid it. They might say they miss you, but what they miss is access. They miss the way trust made proximity easy. They miss the way forgiveness arrived without negotiation. They miss the safety of knowing they could falter without losing position. But trust, once broke, repeatedly, does not return simply because it is missed. You did not become cold. You became careful. You did not withdraw out of resentment, but out of recognition. The version of you they mourn was generous to a fault. The version that exists now is generous with intention. That difference feels like loss to those who benefited from the former without protecting it. Their grief over the old you is a quiet admission. It acknowledges that something valuable was present and is now gone. But grief does not recreate what was lost. It only confirms its absence. And while they mourn, you stand differently, less exposed, more grounded, no longer offering trust where it is not honored. They may never fully understand that the version of you they missed did not disappear by accident. It stepped aside because it learned that trust, once given freely, must eventually be guarded, and that learning, though it cost something precious, gave birth to a self that cannot be crossed in the same way again. Your survival became their quiet terror. They expected damage to finish you. They assumed the weight they placed on your shoulders would eventually bend you into something smaller, quieter, easier to dismiss. In their minds, harm had a predictable outcome: withdrawal, bitterness, collapse. They believed that crossing you would leave a mark so deep it would define you. What they did not anticipate was endurance. At first, they did not notice it. Survival rarely announces itself with drama. It shows up subtly, in steadier posture, in calmer responses, in the absence of desperation. You did not broadcast strength. You simply continued. And that continuation unsettled them more than confrontation ever could have. They had prepared themselves for anger, for retaliation, even for visible pain. They were not prepared for your composure. There is something deeply disturbing to those who cause harm when the one they harmed does not disintegrate. Your survival challenged the narrative they had constructed to justify their behavior. If you were still standing, then the story that you were weak no longer worked. If you were still growing, then the story that they were justified no longer held. Your existence became evidence against them. They began to notice changes they could not explain away. You were less reactive, less eager to be understood, more deliberate in where you placed your energy. You did not chase clarity. You did not demand acknowledgement. You simply adjusted your life in ways that no longer revolved around their presence. That independence was unsettling. It removed their role from your story. What frightened them was not just that you survived, but that you did so without needing their apology. They assumed closure would require their participation. They believed healing would demand conversation, explanation, or remorse. When you moved forward without waiting for any of that, it stripped them of relevance. And irrelevance is terrifying to those who once held influence. Your survival exposed something uncomfortable. They were not as powerful as they believed. The harm they inflicted did not define you. It did not stop your movement. It did not entitle them to a permanent place in your life. You carried the experience, but you did not carry them. That distinction unsettled them deeply. They may not have spoken about it, but they felt it. In quiet moments, they compared who you were now to who you were then. They noticed the strength that had replaced softness, the clarity that had replaced tolerance. They realized that what they attempted to diminish had matured. Survival had refined you. What made it worse was the absence of hostility. You did not seek revenge. You did not speak ill of them. You did not expose or pursue. You simply existed LL without them. That kind of survival offers no argument, no spectacle, only truth. And truth does not need volume to be threatening. They began to sense that your survival carried a cost for them. Not because you punished them, but because your stability highlighted their instability. While you adapted, they remained tethered to the moment they crossed you. While you integrated the pain, they were left circling it. Your life moved forward. Their conscience lingered. Survival changed the power dynamic without announcement. You no longer needed validation. You no longer required permission. You no longer responded to pressure the same way. This shift made them uneasy because it meant they could no longer affect you as they once did. Influence had expired. They may have hoped you would struggle, that difficulty would justify their actions retroactively. Your steadiness denied them that comfort. Your survival removed their excuse. It forced them to confront the possibility that the harm was unnecessary, that the damage was not inevitable, that the fault rested with choice, not circumstance. Your survival became a mirror they could not escape. Every sign of your progress reflected back the reality of what they failed to break. And in that reflection, they saw their limits. They saw that crossing you did not grant them control. It exposed it. They live with that knowledge quietly, not as public shame, but as private disturbance. Because nothing unsettles a person more than realizing the one they tried to diminish walked away stronger and no longer needs to look back to prove it. Access to you was lost the moment integrity replaced tolerance. For a long time, they believed access was guaranteed simply because it always had been. They mistook availability for obligation. They assumed proximity was permanent, not realizing it was sustained by your character, not their entity. Lament. You tolerated much, not because you lacked standards, but because you believed in patience, repair, and the possibility of growth. What they never understood was that tolerance was a choice, not a weakness. Tolerance allowed room for imperfection. It made space for mistakes, misunderstandings, and human failure. You extended it because you valued connection more than control, but tolerance has a boundary, even when it is generous. That boundary is integrity. Integrity is the moment patience stops excusing what conscience can no longer accept. And when that moment arrived, something decisive happened quietly within you. Integrity does not argue, it does not threaten, it does not explain itself repeatedly. It simply withdraws permission. When integrity steps forward, access is no longer emotional. It becomes conditional. And conditions are not negotiable when they are rooted in self-respect. They did not notice the shift immediately because integrity does not announce itself dramatically. You did not raise your voice. You did not issue ultimatums. You did not deliver speeches about boundaries. You simply stopped tolerating what conflicted with who you were becoming. That subtlety confused them. They expected reaction, not resolution. They assumed access was something they possessed rather than something they were allowed. That assumption collapsed the moment you stopped compromising your values to preserve proximity. Integrity asked a different question than tolerance ever did. Tolerance asks, "How much can I endure?" Integrity asks, "What aligns with who I am?" Once that question takes root, the answer reshapes everything. They may have felt the change as distance, but distance was only the symptom. The cause was alignment. You were no longer willing to contort yourself to maintain connection. You were no longer willing to absorb disrespect in the name of peace. Integrity demanded coherence between your inner life and your outward choices, and that coherence required adjustment. Access disappeared not because you hardened, but because you clarified. You stopped offering unlimited entry to someone who had demonstrated they could not be trusted with it. Integrity does not punish, it protects. It protects energy, time, dignity, and truth. And once protection becomes necessary, tolerance steps aside. They may have tried to regain access through familiarity, through shared history, through emotional appeal, but integrity does not respond to nostalgia. It responds to consistency. History explains behavior, it does not excuse it. Integrity does not erase the past, but it refuses to repeat it. What unsettled them was that you did not close the door out of anger. You closed it out of accuracy. There was no bitterness to negotiate with, no hostility to soften. The boundary stood because it made sense, not because it was meant to hurt. That kind of closure feels final because it is not fueled by emotion. It is fueled by clarity. They realized too late that access to you was never unconditional. It was sustained by mutual respect. attentiveness, and care. Once those were absent, access became unsustainable. Integrity did not remove them from your life harshly. It simply stopped holding space for behavior that conflicted with your values. You did not need to justify this shift. Integrity does not seek approval, it seeks alignment. And alignment often costs access because not everyone is willing or able to meet it. That loss is not cruelty. Why? It is consequence. They may have told themselves you changed, that you became distant or rigid. But what truly changed was your relationship with yourself. You stopped abandoning your own standards to maintain connection. You stopped negotiating with discomfort that was trying to teach you something. Integrity asked you to choose yourself without apology. Access, once lost in this way, is rarely restored. Not because forgiveness is impossible, but because integrity does not rewind growth. You cannot unknow what you now know. You cannot unsee what was revealed, and integrity will not allow you to pretend otherwise. They lost access to you not in a dramatic moment, but in a decisive one. The moment you chose truth over tolerance. The moment you decided that being at peace with yourself mattered more than being available to someone who had not protected that peace. Life rearranged itself around you, while instability followed them. This shift did not arrive with spectacle or announcement. It unfolded quietly, almost gently, as though the world itself had been waiting for you to choose alignment before moving pieces into place. When you stepped out of tolerance and into truth, circumstances responded. Paths that once felt blocked loosened. Opportunities appeared without force. Support arrived without begging. You did not chase change, change met you where you stood. This is how alignment works. When a person stops negotiating with what diminishes them, life begins to cooperate. Not because the world is suddenly generous, but because resistance dissolves. Energy that was once spent managing harm, explaining pain, or carrying unnecessary weight becomes available for growth. You noticed it in small ways at first. Mornings felt lighter, decisions felt clearer. Your body held itself differently. You were no longer bracing. What surprised you was how little effort this rearrangement required. You did not manipulate outcomes. You did not engineer revenge. You simply stopped standing in places that drained you, and once you moved, the environment responded. Life tends to organize itself around those who are honest about what they can no longer carry. While things were aligning for you, instability began trailing them like a shadow. Not dramatic collapse, but subtle disruption. Plans stopped holding. Relationships became strained. Confidence began to feel brittle. The ease they once relied on became unreliable. Nothing fell apart all at once, but nothing settled either. Stability requires coherence, and coherence had been absent for some time. They could not understand why things felt harder. From their perspective, nothing had changed. But that was the illusion. Something essential had shifted when you withdrew your participation from the dynamic. Stability they once borrowed from your presence quietly expired. The balance they enjoyed depended on your willingness to absorb discomfort. When you stopped, the imbalance surfaced. Life does not punish arbitrarily, it responds accurately. When behavior is misaligned with truth, friction appears. When patterns are built on avoidance, instability follows. What they experienced was not bad luck, it was exposure. Systems built without integrity cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. Eventually, the structure begins to wobble. You noticed the contrast. While they were scrambling to regain footing, you were settling. Not because you won something from them, but because you reclaimed something within yourself. Life responded to that reclamation. You felt grounded in a way that did not depend on circumstances behaving perfectly. Even challenges felt different, manageable, instructive, proportional. They, on the other hand, felt increasingly reactive. Small disruptions unsettled them. Minor setbacks felt personal. When stability is borrowed rather than built, it disappears the moment the source withdraws. They were left managing consequences they had never prepared for, while you were building on clarity you had earned. This rearrangement also revealed something important. Peace attracts order. When your inner life becomes coherent, your outer life begins to reflect it. Boundaries simplified relationships. Honesty clarified choices. Integrity reduced conflict. You were no longer pulled in opposing directions, and life no longer mirrored chaos back at you. They may have tried to reassert control as instability grew. They may have doubled down on explanations, distractions, or surface-level fixes, but instability rooted in misalignment cannot be solved through adjustment alone. It requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had been delayed too long. What unsettled them most was seeing that your stability did not depend on their collapse. You were not rising because they were falling. You were rising because you stopped resisting what you already knew. Life responded to that truth with quiet precision. You did not feel triumphant, you felt settled. That difference mattered. Stability does not boast, it holds. It allows space for reflection. It creates margin. While they were busy managing fallout, you were building rhythm. While they were reacting, you were responding. Life rearranged itself around you because you made a decision that simplified everything else. You chose alignment over accommodation, truth over tolerance, clarity over comfort. Once that choice was made, the rest followed naturally. Instability followed them not because they were being targeted, but because they were being revealed. What could not stand without your support finally had to stand on its own, and what could not stand on its own began to show signs of strain. You watched this from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. You saw how life corrects imbalance without cruelty, how it restores order without announcement, how it rewards alignment without spectacle. The rearrangement was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. You were no longer fighting the current, you were moving with it. And in that movement, life began to organize itself around who you had become, while instability continued to follow those who refused to face who they were. Their restless conscience became the punishment they cannot escape. No one needed to accuse them. No voice needed to rise against them. What followed them was quieter, more persistent, and far more exhausting. It was the slow, internal unraveling that begins when a person can no longer outrun what they know. Conscience, when ignored too long, does not disappear. It waits. And when it finally awakens, it does not shout, it gnaws. At first they tried to drown it out. Distraction became their refuge. Noise filled the spaces where reflection might have settled. Activity replaced stillness. They kept moving, speaking, explaining, justifying. Anything to avoid the moment when silence might ask questions they did not want to answer. But conscience does not require silence to function. It speaks even in crowds. It whispers even in motion. What unsettled them most was that the voice did not accuse unfairly. It did not exaggerate. It simply repeated what had happened, exactly as it was. The moments they dismissed, the lines they crossed, the times they chose comfort over care. Conscience has no interest in drama, it is precise. That precision made it unbearable. They began to feel it in unexpected moments. A sentence overheard that struck too close. A memory triggered by something ordinary. A pause in conversation that suddenly felt heavy. Their body reacted before their mind could intervene. restlessness, CR, ebbed in, not as fear but as unease. Sleep grew lighter, thoughts circled, peace became conditional. This is the quiet cost of unresolved wrongdoing. It does not announce itself as guilt at first. It appears as irritation, defensiveness, impatience. They became quicker to justify themselves, quicker to explain, quicker to feel misunderstood. Conscience, when ignored, sharpens sensitivity. Every reminder feels like an attack because it threatens the story they tell themselves. They could not escape comparison. When they saw you steady, grounded, unbothered, something tightened inside them. Not envy exactly, recognition. Your calm became a mirror, not because you confronted them, but because your composure highlighted their unrest. You carried no visible burden. They carried one they could not set down. What made it worse was that conscience did not demand punishment from others. It demanded honesty from within. And honesty was the one thing they had delayed the longest. They wanted relief without reckoning, peace without acknowledgement. But conscience does not negotiate terms. It waits until truth is faced, or until denial becomes too exhausting to maintain. They may have told themselves they had moved on, that the past was settled, that time had resolved it. But conscience does not operate on narrative, it operates on alignment. As long as behavior and truth remained misaligned, restlessness persisted. No external success could quiet it. No approval could silence it. No distraction could fully suppress it. They might have looked fine from the outside, functioning, engaged, capable, but inside something was off balance. Conscience creates a subtle tension that never fully releases. It follows them into decision-making, into relationships, into solitude. It colors interactions. It shortens patience. It drains joy. They may have attempted to reframe the story to ease the pressure, to paint themselves as misunderstood, justified, or provoked. But conscience resists distortion. It remembers intention as clearly as outcome. It recalls not only what was done, but why it was done. And that memory does not soften easily. The most exhausting part was that conscience offered no one else to blame. It returned responsibility to its rightful place. That return felt heavy. It required them to sit with the reality that they had harmed someone who did not deserve it, and that no external correction could erase that fact. Awareness became the weight they carried. Unlike consequences imposed from the outside, this one did not end. There was no sentence to serve, no restitution that felt sufficient, no apology that restored peace. Conscience remained active because it had never been answered. It does not punish through pain alone, it punishes through persistence. They could not escape it by forgetting because forgetting was never the issue. They could not escape it by moving on because moving on requires resolution, and resolution requires truth. Without truth, restlessness becomes the permanent background noise of life. This is how conscience disciplines without spectacle. It does not need witnesses. It does not require exposure. It simply refuses to grant rest where integrity has been violated and left unaddressed. And the longer it is ignored, the more deeply it embeds itself into thought, emotion, and perception. They carry it quietly now, not as public shame, but as private unrest. A tension that follows them into stillness, a reminder that some lines once crossed leave marks that cannot be hidden, only lived with. You move forward unchained, while they remain trapped negotiating with yesterday. The difference between you is not loud, but it is absolute. You did not escape by erasing the past, you escaped by integrating it. You faced what happened without reshaping it to protect your ego. You allowed the truth to settle even when it was uncomfortable, and once it settled, It stopped pulling at you. That is how chains loosen, not by denial, but by understanding. Moving forward did not mean pretending nothing happened. It meant refusing to let what happened dictate every step afterward. You learned what the experience revealed about boundaries, discernment, and self-respect. You took the lesson and released the weight. Growth has a way of simplifying life. It strips away unnecessary attachments, clarifies priorities, and restores motion where stagnation once lived. They, on the other hand, are still revisiting moments they wish they could rewrite. Yesterday has become a bargaining table for them. They replay conversations, imagine alternate endings, construct apologies they never delivered at the right time. Their minds circle the same events, hoping repetition will produce a different outcome. But repetition does not rewrite reality. It only reinforces fixation. You no longer need to revisit those moments because you extracted their meaning. Meaning liberates. It allows memory to exist without control. They cannot extract meaning because doing so would require full accountability, and accountability threatens the image they have protected. So they negotiate instead. They soften edges. They revise motives. They explain themselves endlessly, hoping explanation might function as erasure. What sets you apart is not strength alone, but release. You stopped asking the past for permission to live. You did not wait for validation, closure, or recognition to arrive from them. You closed the chapter yourself, not with resentment, but with resolve. That act freed energy that had been tied to rumination and redirected it toward presence. They remain mentally tethered because the past still demands something from them. Acknowledgement, honesty, responsibility. Until that demand is met, yesterday does not loosen its grip. It follows them into new situations, distorting perception, shaping reactions, creating defensiveness where openness could have lived. The past becomes a lens rather than a lesson. You notice the contrast in how time feels. For you, time flows. Days build on each other. Experience accumulates into wisdom. For them, time stalls. Moments feel repetitive. Progress feels thin. When the past is unresolved, the future feels uncertain, and the present feels crowded with unfinished business. Unchained does not mean untouched. It means unburdened. You carry memory without dragging it behind you. You allow the past to inform, not imprison. That freedom is visible in how you move through life now. Less urgency to explain yourself, less tolerance for distortion, more confidence in your decisions. You are no longer reacting, you are choosing. They remain reactive because yesterday still interrupts today. A thought triggers defensiveness. A situation echoes an old mistake. A quiet moment invites memories they would rather avoid. Negotiating with yesterday drains energy that could have been invested elsewhere. It keeps them oriented backward, even as life moves forward without waiting. What they cannot understand is that freedom did not come from being right, vindicated, or proven. It came from acceptance. You accepted what was done, what it revealed, and what it required of you going forward. Acceptance ended the argument. Once the argument ended, the chain loosened. They are still arguing, with themselves, with memory, with possibility, each argument key. PS them anchored to what cannot be changed. They may appear functional, but internally they are stalled. Negotiation is not movement, it is suspension. You feel the difference in your body. Breath comes easier. Decisions carry less hesitation. You trust your instincts because you tested them against experience. Freedom shows up as calm certainty, not bravado. You no longer need to prove resilience, you live it. They sense this separation even if they cannot name it. They feel that you are no longer standing on the same timeline. You are not waiting where they left you. You are not available for revision. You have moved on in a way that does not invite return to the same terrain. And so the final divide settles quietly. You walk forward, carrying insight but no chains. They remain turned toward yesterday, still negotiating terms that no longer exist. The past has released you because you listened to what it came to teach. It still holds them because they have yet to answer what it asks.